Hello there, everybody. It's Mike Yao with Savage Kingdom's role-playing game and Fire in the Head Productions. Haven't done a video in quite a while. It's probably been 3 or 4 weeks. I've been very busy with a professional stage show, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which has been very time-consuming with daily rehearsals, all-day rehearsals and such. And we've opened, and now we've got only three performances left. So like suddenly it's almost getting ready to close this Sunday. It's been great. So three more shows, and then I'll be directing an RPG summer camp directly the week after. So right after the show closes, no rest for the weary. We're straight into that, but that's fine. Those are my two main careers: is acting and game design and game mastering. And then I got to run two more summer camps in August as well. So that'll keep me on my toes, keep me young, and all that sort of thing. But this video today is about game mastering, just some game mastering tips for GMing Savage Kingdoms 3rd Edition specifically. I've done some GMing tips in the past, but it kind of included SK and D&D. And this stuff kind of will be too, like some of the stuff obviously will apply to any other game system, but I wanted to specifically hit on some Savage Kingdoms actual rules that you don't forget to do if you're going to game master, or at least, try not to forget too many of them. It'll definitely help you out. And what prompted me to do this video is one of the stretch goals for the Savage Kingdoms Heroic Adventures supplement, which I'm about 30 to 40% done writing now. I've slowed down a little bit because of all the busyness I just listed, but I'll have a little more time opening up after like in about a week and a half or so. So I should be able to kind of catch. Actually, I'm in a pretty good spot. I think I'm where I should be. But anyway, because I'm game mastering for the $25 and up people is one of the stretch goals. You get 2 sessions with me, I'm thought. So I'm GMing these game sessions, right? And that's all well and good because I love game mastering. But it'd be cool to like give some tips to other people who want to GM SK as well. I think some people view Savage Kingdoms as being a little overwhelming game mastering wise, and kind of agree in some ways. Mostly don't agree. D&D 5th edition is probably a little easier to kind of compare it to that, only because it's a lot more supportive and supported and a lot more out there, and they did simplify it to some degree. There are some things actually harder than SK 3rd edition to GM as well, though, so keep that in mind. But anyway, I'm just want to help you guys out, and girls and gals and whoever, if you want to GM SK. Here's a couple little tips. Now, some of the stuff is already in the book, in the core rule book on page 299, chapter 19. There's about, what did I do? About 4 pages there it's just called Game Mastering Savage Kingdoms. They're like little tips and reminders, things not and shortcuts and hacks and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to hit on like somewhat more of the mechanical stuff instead of the advice, storytelling, narrative stuff, although I'll weave a little bit of that in, but I don't want to take too much time with this video. I end up rambling like I'm already doing. So let's start off with, so I have 12 things written down to cover. They're not in any particular order. They literally just kind of whatever came to mind. So they're not in any importance of order of importance or anything like that. Number 1, this seems like a no-brainer, but I think it's worth mentioning. Knowledge or familiarity in the rules and setting. I know, especially in D&D 5th edition, there's a lot of new game masters, a lot of new players wanting to GM and DM, and that's great. And they're like, oh, they're so excited. They want to help tell the story, and they want to kind of referee the stuff and kind of be the director, as I call the stage manager of the group. And that's all well and good. But they kind of forget sometimes to do an integral thing, and that's like learn the bloody rules. More than just so. If you're a player character, you know some of the rules because you kind of have to know some things, at least what some of your abilities are doing. The GM or DM can handle kind of the rest of it, and that's all well and good. So I think sometimes when a player makes a move to become a game master, he or she is just using that player base of knowledge and assume they can suddenly GM is saying, no, you need to learn a lot more than that. So you don't have to master all the rules. I mean, no one can memorize every single rule, but be pretty darn familiar not only with the rules but the setting. Particularly in SK Savage Kingdoms, the setting and the rules definitely support each other. They very much tie in, and I think most role-playing game systems do that. And the reason I mention that is because D&D is actually not as much like that. It's mostly a core system supporting a bunch of other worlds. Forgotten Realms may be the default world, but there's all these other worlds that it has to kind of support too. So it's actually a little more of a core engine. So you can learn. I said I was was going to make this D&D about D&D and mostly about SK, but here I go. But anyway, to continue the example, you can learn the core system of D&D 5th edition and not really have mastery of any of the settings. Not as much true as Savage Kingdom's 3rd edition. You really have to kind of, one really kind of weaves into the other. But don't look at it as two different things you have to master. It's really just one ball of it altogether. The rules support the setting and vice versa. Mostly the former way, though. All right, so yeah, just to kind of be familiar with what's up there, and I'll get into a little bit more of that a little bit later, so I go down the list. Number 2, using critical successes and using double critical successes. So it's really 2A and 2B. So as you may or may not know, if you score a 20 above what you need on a skill roll or any D20 roll in the system, that is a critical success. So what is what you need? What you need is the target number. The target number is known as a DL or difficulty level. So D&D has DC, difficulty class. Savage Kingdoms, we have DL, the difficulty level. If you score 20 above what you need, say for example, the DL is an easy task, which is DL 10, and you get a 30. You critically succeed. Critical success, each skill has like a little chart you can roll on or select what happens if it were a critical success. You can come up with your own. You can even allow the player to do it if you can kind of trust them if they're kind of good with the system. You can always veto it if you want. Critical failure is also listed in the skills. Each spell has a critical success and critical failure listing as well. So, and remember, you don't. So when you roll a natural 20 in Savage Kingdoms, that is an exploding 20. In fact, I loosely kind of call the system the X20 system. It's not official. Exploding 20. Meaning that you roll again and add that result to the former result. So you don't add the bonus, though. You don't add the modifier twice. So say you have a +5 and whatever it is that you're rolling, and you roll a natural 20, so that's a 25. You pick up the die, roll again, roll a 12. That's 37 total, right? So you don't add the bonus again on that second roll. If it explodes, you roll a second 20, then it keeps exploding. So you might end up with a 55 or 68 or something. I've seen it. It's very rare, but I've seen it a couple times. So that could be a double. There's an optional rule in the book to have a double critical success, meaning if you score 40 above what you need, that's a double critical. So that's an optional rule. You don't have to do it. I actually do it. I actually use probably 2/3 of the optional rules that I've put in the Savage East as well as the core rule book. You'll see there's a couple pages of that in there. So a double critical success would be that two things happen, two critical effects happen. Say if it's in combat, it might be if you're using a spear, it might be that you impale the opponent and knock them prone, or you knock the helmet off and knocked him prone, or whatever it is. So remember, unlike in D&D, critical hit or critical success in combat in SK is not extra damage. Well, it kind of is, but it's not. So in other words, you're not rolling damage dice. You're only rolling D20s in Savage Kingdoms. You don't have other dice, which I'll get to in a second. The reason I say it's doing a lot of damage, the fact that you rolled 20 over means you've done at least 20 points of damage if your weapon is capable of that, because the base damage is decided between your difference of the attack roll and the opponent's defense, which I'll get to in a second. So it's already a lot of damage plus whatever effect happens, knocking the person prone, knocking them off a cliff, knocking them back a yard or two, knocking their helmet off, breaking their shield, disarming their weapon, whatever. It's a bunch of different things that can happen according to the chart and what you can come up with. So think about using double critical successes or even triple. If somebody scores 60 above, I've only seen it maybe twice, maybe 3 times in running this game for 8 years. Oh my God, it goes back to 12. What is time? 2014 is where the first edition of Savage Kingdoms came out. Wow. Yeah, I've seen that maybe 3 times. A triple critical success. One actually fairly recently. Think about that, whether you want to use those or not. Number 3, attack rolls, damage, maximum damage, arm piercing, and armor. Kind of ties into what I just mentioned. So remember, an attack roll in Savage Kingdoms is a skill roll like any other thing. In D&D, I think they differentiate skill proficiencies and attack rolls, but in SK, they're really the same thing. For example, if you're elbowing someone or punching them or kicking them, that is using the brawling skill to make the attack. If you're using a spear, a battle axe, or a sword, that is a melee weaponry skill roll. If you're throwing a hand axe or loosing an arrow from a bow, that is a ranged weaponry skill roll. So they're all skill rolls, meaning that you roll the d20. D20 is the only dice that are used in SK. We don't use any other dice. And the reason why is because damage is the differential between what you score on your attack roll and the defense of your opponent. Say, for example, your opponent's defense is 16 and you roll a 22, and we'll say it's a bow shot, range weaponry roll. You succeeded by 6, right? So that would be you would score 6 points of damage against that opponent. And then you would add any armor piercing. If this is a longbow, longbows have an armor piercing of 1. Armor piercing is just a fancy term for bonus damage. So AP1 would add an extra point of damage. So in this case, you would deal 7 points of damage. And then there's armor. So armor is D&D. There's armor class, right, which is just kind of your quick ability to get out of the way and your ability to absorb damage all kind of in one number, which is fine. It's not super realistic, but it's very quick, which is what I like about it. This system SK is just as quick, but in a different way. So it's quicker. SK is quicker because you're not rolling separate damage dice. It's literally just off that 1d20 roll. So that saves a ton of time, people grabbing dice and adding them up and all that stuff. But you do have one more step in SK because you have to apply armor if the opponent is even wearing armor at all. If not, there's not even another step. So you make the attack roll, figure out the damage if it succeeds, add armor piercing if there's any. A lot of weapons, maybe even light weapons, and most one-hand medium weapons don't even have armor piercing unless they're master crafted. So armor piercing is just bonus damage. And then armor subtracts. Armor absorbs or subtracts damage like it kind of does in real life. So, for example, if you have an armor rating of 4 or a protection rating of 4, and that would be like mastercrafted brigandine or a chainmail shirt, hard leather with a small buckler type shield. I think it's 4 armor. Anyway, there's different ways of getting 4 points of armor. This is just an example. So if you're hit for 7 points of damage, like in that last example, and you have 4 points of armor, you take 3 points of damage. You just subtract the 4 from the damage. So pretty easy. You just have to remember it. So the first couple sessions, it's a little like, wait, what? If you're used to D&D, but once you get into groove, it's like super fast. In fact, it goes faster than D&D 5th edition, which is pretty fast actually, honestly. So there's a cheat around that. You can add your armor to your defense or to the opponent's defense. That's kind of the hack around it. So reason that's not the official rules, there are talents that can get around that. There's something called finessing shot. There's precision strike. There's ways to defeat armor to hit in a lightly armored area or a non-armored area at all. So you have to be careful with that. So, but 95% of the time, you could probably just add the armor to the defense rating. Just add it all together and just count it as that. But yeah, it's only in those rare cases that you would have to keep in mind the actual armor. All right, moving on. Number 4, I think it's enough for that little area. Number 4, ranges are in yards. So in Savage Kingdoms, ranges are in yards and not feet. This is primarily because it's a slightly more outdoor-based game. So D&D does feet. A few other games do too, but I haven't really seen that many. Because it's more of a dungeon-based game, or originally was, and so it made more sense, because feet is actually technically an indoor measurement. Yards is really an outdoor measurement. That's what yards are for. Or paces, same thing. So that's why I put SK in yards, because it's predominantly more of an overland thing. Doesn't really, it definitely can do lots of dungeon delving in SK, and in fact, it's cool to do so, but it's largely an overland, more of a sweeping adventure kind of game. So I put it in yards. I also did it because, as an athlete or former athlete, I know that, well, there's more athletes that are gamers now. I think back in the day there weren't as many, but and I think a lot of us athletes can see yards better. Like I'm used to seeing, I'm doing off camera because I'm looking off in my front yard. I can see 50 yards easier than I can see 150 feet, even though it's the same. It's just registers in my head. I'm used to seeing a football field or a soccer field with the hash marks, and it's just easier to visualize yards outdoors. And again, yards are actually for outdoors. measurements. Anyway, so just keep that in mind. So if you see a spell range of like 10, you're like, what the? It's 10 yards, so 30 feet. And it actually literally says yards. But if you just look at the number without looking at the word after, then you might get a little confused. So speaking of which, spell ranges are, you might notice, are fairly short in SK. I did that on purpose because I used to think that D&D spell ranges are really far, kind of ridiculously far. So by reducing them, I kind of did two things there. One, I think I made it a little more reined in, a little more grounded, maybe a little more, quote, realistic, unquote. There's also a talent called far-reaching magic that can double ranges of spells. But also it's kind of a secret little way to rein in the power of spellcasters, which has traditionally been a big problem in a lot of RPGs, particularly in third and fourth, and to some degree fifth edition D&D, particularly. And there's a couple little things they did in the rules that kind of curtail that, and that's actually one of them. So just know that ranges are in yards. Number 5, skill levels and skill level achievements. All right, so skill levels. So first of all, there's skills in the game, right? There's 30 skills in Savage Kingdoms. Skills are, so almost anything you're trying to accomplish in the game is a skill check or skill roll is officially what they're called. Same thing, really. I say almost all of it because there occasionally you roll a d20 for a luck roll. Luck is actually a derived trait. Or when you're rolling initiative, initiative is a derived trait. So it's technically not a skill roll, but it is a d20 roll that you're adding something to. So basically, but in this case, I'm talking about skills themselves. There's still 10 skill levels of each skill, from 0 being unskilled at all or untrained, all the way up to 10, which is grand mastery, and then all in between. So just kind of keep in mind as a game master that it's easier to visualize 1 to 10, right? We do it all the time on a daily basis. Oh, that person's an 8, or that person's knowledge is a 6.5. So you can, so if you know an NPC has 8 skill levels in something, which should be pretty rare, that person is almost a grandmaster. Grandmaster, I think, is skill levels 9 and 10 in the skill. 8 is mastery, or 7 and 8. So just kind of keep that in mind as far as narration, but also game mechanics. And also with skill levels. So every 3 skill levels, don't forget you get a skill specialty within that skill. Now, some characters start with several free skill specialties based on their culture, in some cases their race. That's the only time you can really have a specialty in a skill without having at least 3 skill levels in it. So also, there's something called skill level achievements. At skill levels 4, 7, and 10, you get little bonus things. Make sure you look in the skill section for those. Those get overlooked a lot. I myself still kind of do it from time to time. That might give you some little thing like +1 to athletics because you have 4 skill levels in brawling, or you don't have -2 to brawling rolls against an armed opponent anymore if you have 7 skill levels in it. Something like that. I'm just giving some examples. 7 skill levels in range weaponry, I think, allows you to load a crossbow as a free action instead of an action. Just couple little cool little benefits that you get from skill level achievements, and instead of like through talents in other ways. So just be mindful of those. They're pretty interesting. All right, number 6, initiative and crits. So initiative, the reason I wanted to break this out specifically is this is a good example of a critically succeeding in something that's not a skill roll, like I just mentioned a few moments ago. Initiative is technically a derived trait. It's one of the 6 derived traits of your character. It's derived from agility and willpower. A couple of talents can modify it as well. Roll a d20, add your initiative bonus to that, or negative, but usually it's a bonus. And that is your initiative in at the beginning of a combat round or other action scene. Remember, initiative is not necessarily always for combat. Sometimes it's for some other action scene. In other words, something that you really need to define, like things are happening in micro moments. And when you're exploring in exploration mode, or you're in social mode and in a social encounter, exploring a city, or you're at a feast, or you're exploring the wilderness and you're tracking something or hunting, time tends to go in bigger blocks, right? Usually have 15-minute hours sometimes. Initiative, suddenly we're in 6-second micro moments. So remember, initiative for combat, but also action scene, a chase scene perhaps through a city. something like that, where it becomes very incremental and also very, very specific about who goes first and what. So the reason I mentioned crits next to initiative is that you can critically succeed. Remember, in SK, you can succeed on anything that uses a D20. In fact, if you make a luck roll, because that's a D20, luck is a derived trait. You set the DL at 10, and somehow they get a 30 on a luck roll, then they critically succeeded their luck roll. So something extra might happen. So in the case of initiative, if you critically succeed in initiative, that means if you roll 20 above what the opponent rolled, let's say you run into a war band of goblins, or goblins, they're also known as, and it looks like they're going to attack, or one of them is attacking, wings an arrow at you, and this kicks off this whole scene, which starts with initiative in game mechanics terms. And they roll, say the goblins get a 10 and you get a 30. So that's a critical success, right? Because you scored 20 above. So critical success and initiative means you get 3 actions in the first round of combat. So an extra action, in other words. So you get 3 actions instead of just 2. So that's only in the first round of combat. Remember, it's not through the entire combat. Somehow you're not just like, your adrenaline isn't like bursting for 10 minutes. So it just means you just kind of get a jump on someone enough to where you squeeze in an extra second or so of action. So that's what that represents. You can also critically fail initiative as well. Conversely, so you can so if you get a 0, remember critical failures, or if you score a 0, a modified 0 in a skill roll or any D20 roll, or if you score 10 less than the DL by rolling a natural 1. So there's 2 ways to get critical failures. So for example, say you have -1 in initiative and you roll a 1, that's a 0. Modified, that is a critical failure. Critical failure in initiative means you only get 1 action in the opening round of combat and or other action scene. Just the first round though, then you get 2 after that. So yeah, just remember critical failures are modified result of 0, or you rolled a natural 1 and your total result was 10 less than what you need. That's critical failure, not only in initiative, but any other D20 based thing, skills or whatever. Number 7, codes of honor. So codes of honor, there's a code of honor system in Savage Kingdoms. It kind of replaces the alignment system, and also kind of like the what do you see in D&D? Like Paladin Oaths, I think, have a similar system. So codes of honor are allowed to be a little more detailed without just being this generic alignment thing. Alignments are kind of annoying anyway, and just a little basic. So every culture has a code of honor and race. Every organization or order or sect that you can join in Savage Kingdoms has a code or tenet as well. So if you a member of an order and your cult, you might have 2 different things to follow. So just the cultural ones aren't really that specific. It's more really just to give people a role-playing idea of like how this culture tends to react to certain things, what they tend to believe in, that sort of thing. It's not very hard-coded. It does supposed to kind of give you sort of a grounding there. There's even an optional rule that if people really go out of their way to really play these cultural mores and such, you might give them every other advancement a +1 to luck or +1 to renown. They might become more renowned because of the fact that they are so steadfast to their beliefs and stuff like that would be kind of cool. In the order of, in the sense of orders and organizations, secret organizations, that stuff, the codes and tenets and codes of honor and codes of behavior tend to be a little more specific, particularly in like some of the more secret ones or religious orders. If you break couple of the code. I mean, you can get away with 1 or 2 things, but if you break a serious tenet, you might get excommunicated. You could get or banished. You could get executed, perhaps ritualistically executed or publicly executed or whatever. You could get cursed. There's a list and all the different codes of honor you can come up with, and GM is free to come up with stuff as well that might be similar or in the same vein. So yeah, codes of honor is kind of a cool way. That's why those are there, and they kind of get overlooked. So that's why I wanted to mention them. Number 8, DLs and skill checks / rolls. So DL just means difficulty level. I think I mentioned that earlier. Skill rolls. A skill roll is technically what they're game mechanically called in SK, but if someone says skill check, it's fine. It's the same thing. Or skill test. It's really the same thing. And you're just trying to hit a difficulty level, which is a target number. So you're rolling d20, adding the bonus if there is one or a penalty, and you're trying to match the DL or go higher than the DL. There is an optional rule in one of the books. I don't know if it's in the Savage East or if it's in the core rule book, but it's in there somewhere that if you roll exactly on the number, the DL, you succeed, but I think I called it a marginal success or something like that, or nominal success, meaning that you succeeded in what you were going to do, but some little minor complication occurred. A good example would be like you're trying to leap over a chasm and you rolled exactly on the number you needed for your athletics roll, probably in this case. So maybe an arrow fell out of your quiver, or maybe you grab the edge of the side and someone else has to pull you up, or you have to succeed in another athletics check to pull yourself up. Something like that. So some kind of minor thing. So think about possibly using those. When I wrote the rule, I was all excited. I'm like, and then I don't think I've ever used them. So, and maybe I will. I don't know. So just know about that. And again, if you score 20 above the DL, that's critical success. It doesn't have to be an exploding 20. I mean, if you score 20 above what you need, even without exploding a 20, if you're that good at something, or the DL was that simple, then yeah, you can critically succeed as well. You perhaps should also critically fail as well. Number 9, spells and ritual magic. So I want to break this out specifically. So it says in the book, in the chapter about magic and in the magical arts skill section as well. So it's pretty well documented in the book, but just wanted to add a few more things to it and maybe some reminders. So ritual magic is actually the default way magic is performed in the Savage Kingdom setting, not necessarily by player characters, although I've seen one or two player characters maybe use ritual magic more than spontaneous magic, which is another name for battle magic or battle casting. But most NPCs in the world have the time to do that. So a ritual takes an hour, and it does give you a +2 bonus to your magical arts skill roll at the end of that. If you're not interrupted at the end of that hour ritual, and so that's why a lot of people do that. It's giving a better chance for the spell to succeed. And that's supported in the narrative of the game and the lore of the game by so magic is very intuitive in SK. A lot of settings too, but particularly like it's not written down that often. There's a talent called Grimoire, which allows you to learn an extra spell. You have stuff actually written in that, and the fact that that's broken out as its own thing kind of should tell you that magic is actually seldom really written down. It's more of an oral thing, and each spellcaster or magician casts a spell probably slightly different unless he's learned it directly from his master or something like that. And even then, he or she probably has his own little flair to it, right? So it's very intuitive, very oral based, literally, because the more powerful spells are spoken. You can try to not speak a spell, but remember it is -5 to the magical arts roll if you want to cast silently. If you want to cast without gestures, that's another -5. So if you don't want to gesture and speak, you definitely want to do force of will cast a spell. It's actually possible, but it's -10. There are a couple of talents that get rid of that, like silence and power. Silence is power, or power of silence, and words of power. Sort of negate those. So look into that. So just anyway, this is all stuff to kind of keep in mind as the game master, because this part of spell casting I think is a little different than a lot of other game systems, particularly D&D. And you do have to succeed in a magical arts skill roll. All the spells do not automatically succeed. A ritual spell adding a +2 definitely gives you a better chance of success. And casting a spell at a lower DL definitely helps too, like a simpler spell. So you're almost guaranteed in some senses, but you still have to make that roll because you could get a critical success. You probably want to make that roll anyway. You could also get a critical failure, which can be pretty bad in some of the spells. Pretty interesting. You can actually come up with some weaknesses. You can actually accidentally summon a demon or something like that. So can be pretty interesting, or maybe you spend extra stamina. Speaking of which, remember spellcasting does run off of stamina. There's other things in the game that run off of stamina as well. Certain combat maneuvers, even a couple social abilities do that. Actual regular mundane real world things cost stamina as well, like sprinting for minutes, of course. Rowing a boat for hours without stopping, stuff like that. Traveling more than 10 hours in a day, stuff like that. So keep that all in mind. Let's see, spells and ritual magic. What else I want to mention about that? Spells. So, oh yeah, remember spell casting to use the magical arts skill. And there's 7 sub skills of magical arts, also known as disciplines. There's air, earth, fire, water, life, death, and shadow magic. Those are what's called disciplines of magic or types. Um, so you have to make a skill roll in order to make this spell succeed. But in order to even use that skill, you have to have a talent. That's the only type of skill in the game that you have to have a certain talent in order to even use. That would be Magic Affinity, Acolyte, Apprentice, Dabbling Arcanist, I think maybe is one of them. Anyway, there's several. But the 3 main ones are Magic Affinity, Acolyte, and Apprentice. Magic Affinity means you were born with the gift of magic, something in your blood, you just kind of a knack for it. But you can't start off with more than 2 skill levels in any magical arts at character creation because you're not really trained in it. It's more intuitive. Acolyte means that you had some religious training. You learned, I think it's just 1 magical arts, maybe it's 2. And then if your intellect is high enough, you gain a bonus spell that you would have learned at the foot of your priestly mentor. The other one is apprentice, where you learned from a non-religious kind of area, like from you actually had like an apprentice relationship with some old master who taught you, and you get to choose 2 magical arts disciplines to advance in if you so choose. You don't have to do 2; it can just be 1, but keep those in mind. Magic Affinity, again, the drawback is only 2 skill levels to start with, but you can advance in any of the 7 magical arts, just all of them if you want. Granted, that's probably where about all your skill points would be, and that's about all you'd be good at, but you could be a pretty powerful magician were you to survive kind of early advancements like that. So that's spells and ritual magic. Oh yeah, last thing about ritual magic. So each spell lists ritual materials. Remember that spellcasters or magicians or mages have to have at least 2 of those components that are listed. Some of them you have to have 3. Some of the higher DL, more powerful spells. The rule of thumb is DL 25 or less, you only need 2 of those items. DL 30 or more, you need 3 or more of those items that are on the list. And the list usually has 4 to 5 different objects on there. There's some objects, if you have like a dragon's bone, for example, or some dirt that where a shadow wraith walked over, something like that, it actually gives you a +3 bonus when casting a ritual spell instead of a +2 because they have kind of an inherent power in them. So those are kind of cool. What else? And then every odd number of magical arts, every odd skill level that you have invested in a magical art skill is how many spells you know. For example, say you start off with magical arts fire level 3, 1 and 3, so that's 2 spells you would know of that discipline. And say you decided to take a second magical arts water, and you have 2 skill levels in that to start. So skill level 1 gave you another spell, so that would be 3 spells to start with. Yeah, 3 spells to start with. Possibly, if you have the acolyte talent and your intellect's high enough, you might start off with a 4th spell. So just an example. Every odd skill level earns you a new spell. So let's say you advance and you put skill points in a magical arts discipline to gain another odd number level. You would learn a new spell. You might learn 2 that advancement if you put points in another discipline if you have another discipline. So yeah, keep that in mind. Number 10, grounded Dark Ages is what I put. All right, so I think what I meant by that is, as a game master of SK, remember that the game is kind of a Dark Ages setting. In fact, on the front of the book, my little blurb at the bottom, I think says immersive role playing in a gritty world of Dark Ages fantasy. And I almost put dark fantasy there, but dark fantasy is almost kind of its own little sort of subgenre. And SK is dark fantasy-ish, but not entirely, because I think some people think, okay, no, it's like gothic horror fantasy. And that's not exactly the case. Savage Kingdoms is kind of sword and sorcery. That's how I used to build it as. In fact, it's part of the logo still. But it's not exactly. It's almost become its own thing as well. But if you keep in mind dark fantasy and sword and sorcery, you'll pretty much have it right. You're pretty much in the right kind of feel and genre of Savage Kingdoms. Also, keep it grounded. So you might notice if you're familiar with SK, read through the books a little bit, it's a somewhat grounded game. There's definitely fantastical elements. I mean, there's some pretty powerful spells, but they're really rare and hard to get a hold of. They're not typically quite as over the top as say high level D&D spells. Sure, there's a flight spell. Characters can eventually fly, but it's pretty limited. The disappearance is, invisibility spell, but it's also somewhat limited. So a lot of that is kind of reined in because it's kind of grounded, and it takes a lot of stamina to cast some of those things. So it can wipe out a mage pretty quickly, make them pretty fatigued. So so again, all that stuff is there to kind of balance it out. It allows magic to be kind of potent, but it's not overshadowed at all by, say, martial expertise or stealth or guile or social power. I went to kind of all those even, and I think it mostly works out. So keep that in mind. It's kind of grounded. Good example is Game of Thrones. I know some people, the cable show, I still really love it. I know the last couple seasons it kind of failed, and I kind of agree. But that aside, that one storyline aside, the world building itself is really good. The fact that there's kind of gray morality um, is very Savage Kingdoms. If you think Conan's world of the Hyborian Age is another good example of grounding fantasy. So if you ground your fantasy more in kind of a medieval, Dark Ages, antiquated world setting, when something fantastical happens, it resonates a lot more. So that's a big plus for grounding. Not only is that the world is kind of written that way, but as far as narrating the world, if you can kind of ground it, so when mystical things happen, they pop a lot more. Again, Game of Thrones is a good example. When a dragon was finally seen, it was like a big thing. If you're in a high fantasy world, well, all that stuff is seen on a daily basis, and then it happens a minute later. It doesn't matter because it's just all part of the background, right? So that's kind of the difference to sort of keep in mind. So kind of grounding your fantasy in sort of a Dark Ages kind of feel. You have the right idea there. So number 11, Downtime Activity. So there's about 4 pages, chapter 19 in the core rule book, starting on page 296, I believe. Yeah, 296. Lists a bunch of different downtime activity that you can do. Downtime activity is very similar to D&D and maybe some other game systems as well that I haven't really looked at as much. But they go in a week, so the minimum it takes to do one of these downtime activities is a week. Even if it's something you think that, like, I could do that in 2 hours. It Remember, it represents a lot more stuff. Say if you were trying to go fence and that's one of the things listed: fencing, a rare item, research, study, spying, prayer, meditation, courting, romance, carousing, crafting, hunting, curing, fencing, selling. All these are viable options in the downtime actions. But say a character wants to go fence an item and he goes to finds a smuggler or some uh, shadow hand representative, and it probably feels like, oh, I could have done that in an hour or two. It's like, but remember, they probably spent several days finding out where the contact is. Maybe you had to come back the next day because he had to like make another So just think of it more like that. It's just kind of an easy bookkeeping way of now some downtime activities might take 2 or 3 weeks. I think they specifically say, but in general, each activity takes at least a week. Also, if characters advance and they pick up a talent that has an asterisk next to it, remember that's a talent that if you don't start with, you have to get improvement from the game master. And generally, it also costs at least a week of downtime action. It depends on what it is. So just let the GM know, because you may not need to represent a couple of weeks of learning that particular talent, because it may be a less intuitive thing that required maybe some actual training or something to do. That's what the asterisk represents. Downtime activity. Oh, and by the way, so 3 downtime actions are the most you can take at any. So even if the character takes a year off from adventuring and just kind of chills out, he or she still only gets 3 downtime activity or actions, regardless. So, and I think that's fairly realistic. A lot of us say, "Oh, I'm going to take a year off, and because I want to do this and this and that," and we end up only accomplishing like the 3 of the 12 things we say anyway. It's just human nature. Um, Given all this time off, you tend to kind of go at a slower pace because you can. So that kind of represents that. So keep that in mind as well. All right, and a lot of downtime actions will require a skill roll to see if, how successful it is or something like that. Also, to remember to keep in mind, the reason I want to mention downtime activity in particular is that it's not prime time activity. So some players will try to turn this downtime activities into like a major thing, and that can be fine. That can actually spur. I've had several adventures spur from that, which is awesome. But don't let it bog too much down. If it becomes like primary, if it's like primary role playing territory, then let it be such. Kind of maybe come out of the downtime and let that be the prime time activity. So just kind of keep that in mind. Last thing I'm going to talk about, because it's 40 minutes into this video, and I only wanted to do like 30, 35, but that's all right. Last thing is gear slash bulk, or equipment slash bulk. So bulk is a system in Savage Kingdoms. Instead of using pounds, instead of like minute measurements, like pounds would be or kilos or something like that, we use a bulk system. So a bulk, like bulk one, is like an 8 to 15 pound object, roughly. I mean, it could be less, could be more. For example, a sack of feathers probably only weighs about 2 pounds, maybe 3 pounds, but it's massive and ridiculous and has about probably 30 or 40 pounds worth of like encumbrance. It kind of makes up for the fact that it's light because it's so big and bulky. So that's why the bulk system is not exactly precise, but it's an easy way to keep track without having to do minute detailing of every pound. So a physique plus 0 or physique 0 character can carry up to 6 bulk without being hindered, which is the next level of encumbrance. That's a -2, an additional -2 to your skill penalty for like armor and stuff. Because remember, certain armor types actually give penalties to certain skills. Skills that have asterisks next to them, such as acrobatics, athletics, brawling, all the magical arts, stealth. Um, yeah, so keep that in mind. The next level of encumbrance is burdened, and that's -5 to those skill rolls and -5 to your mobility as well. So yeah, you're going really slow at that point. And that would be for an average person bulk over bulk 12 that you're carrying. So to give you an example of bulk 12, that's like carrying 12 great axes, or wearing a suit of plate and chain and carrying like 6 others with you in packs or just hanging over your body. Stuff like that. Give good example of stuff like that. So yeah, so bulk system is a little easier to deal with. I just personally just kind of eyeball most of it. I mean, I kind of keep track of it, but I don't linger on it. I usually trust my players to. And every so often, if they start picking up things off the battlefield, I say, what bulk are you carrying right now? And that kind of makes them look and go, oh yeah, I'm a bulk 4. I better kind of watch it or whatever. Now, if your character is a character with a physique of -3 or so, they can only carry up to like bulk 4 before they're slowed to the next category. So it does depend on your physique. Physique +2 can carry up to 10 bulk before they're slowed to the next category. So anyway, there's a whole chart in the book about that. I just wanted to throw that out there. So I think that's it. That's going to wrap it up here at 43 minutes. So I went through 12 points, just kind of little GMing tips for people who want to maybe try to run some Savage Kingdoms. Hopefully you stayed with me this far into the video here at 43 minutes. Heard me rambling. Hopefully you got something out of it. Please like and subscribe and share and all that stuff. Not only have been busy, being busy has been the reason I haven't done as many videos, but haven't been quite as inspired because it's just, I don't know, I'm not getting a whole lot of traction. I know I'm not really advertising the channel that well. That's mostly my fault. But if you can let people know about it, like, subscribe, and all that kind of stuff, that'd be awesome. Well, thanks for sticking with me this long. I'll talk to you guys again soon. Bye.